All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's California Offshore Wind webinar. My name is Zoe Chan, and I'm one of the technical advisors for the Envirothon Aquatics team. And today we have two great speakers, and this meeting will be recorded. So I'm hoping that folks are tuning in on their own time. So thank you so much, Holly and Whitney, for dedicating an hour of your time today to present. Um, and today we have two speakers. One is Holly. Holly Wire is a senior environmental scientist at the California Coastal Commission. She has over 10 years of experience working in coastal resource management and is the lead staff on offshore wind at the California Coastal Commission. Holly led the marine resources analysis for the Coastal Commission's approval of offshore wind leasing and site assessment of California in 2022. Today, she'll be speaking about the Coastal Commission's role in permitting offshore wind development. And our second speaker today is Whitney Grover. Whitney is the Deputy Director of the Golden Gate Bird Alliance, which is dedicated to protecting San Francisco Bay Area birds, wildlife, and their natural habitats through conservation, activism, and education. Whitney graduated from the University of San Francisco with a master's degree in environmental management, and today she'll be presenting her master's work on potential impacts to seabirds from offshore wind projects. Today, we're going to start with Holly's presentation, followed by Whitney's, and we're going to hold the Q&A portion of the webinar after both presentations, but feel free to put questions in the chat as they come up. And with that, I will pass it off to Holly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm hoping you all can hear me all right. Please let me know if you can't. And I'll be sharing my screen in just a moment. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so thank you for having me here today. As Zoe said, I'm Holly Wire. I'm here from the California Coastal Commission. And I just wanted to briefly mention that the Coastal Commission is a state agency in California that is responsible for permitting development in the state's coastal zone. We also implement a federal law called the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is what's going to be the focus of the presentation today. So today I'm going to talk about why California is pursuing offshore wind, the Coastal Commission's role in offshore wind, our review of the Humboldt wind energy area as a case study, environmental and community considerations, and next steps in collaboration. This presentation is really meant to be a starting point for discussion, so I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. So why is California interested in offshore wind development? On a high level, the state is working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by electrifying everything from cars to homes to businesses and bringing more renewable electricity generation online. We rely really heavily on solar to meet demand for renewables, but when the sun goes down, solar production stops, and this is when our electricity demand is the highest. However, evening is when wind is most productive, and offshore wind is expected to be more productive than current onshore wind resources. To take advantage of the benefits of having a renewable energy source producing during peak energy usage hours, the California Energy Commission has set aspirational planning goals of 2 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 25 gigawatts by 2045. Offshore wind development in California is planned for federal waters, so I want to take a moment to discuss the federal leasing process. And this really ties into the Coastal Commission's role later. Offshore wind development in federal waters is led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. Their role is to lease or rent out federal waters for energy production. The graphic here provides an overview of BOEM's process, and we're somewhat early in the process where the red arrow is. BOEM has announced the auction winners for California leases, and those lessees are now beginning plans for surveys and studies on their lease areas. The lessees will submit a construction and operations plan to BOEM up to 5 years from now. And that construction and operations plan describes how the lessees will develop their lease and start projects. And that also starts up project-specific environmental review. And the green arrows on the slide show when the Coastal Commission does Coastal Zone Management Act review in this process. So in a little bit, I'm going to be talking about the Humboldt wind energy area as a case study. And that was that first CZMA review that you see on the slide, and then the one for the COP is the second one on the orange section. The Coastal Commission has a unique role in offshore wind permitting because we implement the Coastal Zone Management Act. The Coastal Zone Management Act is a federal law that creates a partnership between the state and federal government and provides states with decision-making authority over federal actions or permits that impact state waters or state coastal resources. The state has jurisdiction over state waters, which extends up to 3 nautical miles from shore, and the federal government has jurisdiction beyond that out to 200 nautical miles. Our authority under the Coastal Zone Management Act means that we're the only state agency that has an official action at the leasing phase of BOEM's, at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's process. And in our case, that first review focused on lease exploration activities and a siting level analysis of the proposed lease areas and what it would mean to develop them in the future. For the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to use our review of the Humboldt wind energy area as a case study for assessing the impact of offshore wind. This map shows the Humboldt wind energy area. It's roughly 20 miles off the coast of Humboldt County at its closest point, and it's almost 207 square miles in size. This case study will look at the Coastal Zone Management Act review we did in 2022. And when we did that review, we covered both the environmental impacts of leasing the Humboldt wind energy area and site assessment activities. And site assessment activities include geophysical and geotechnical surveys, biological surveys, siting met ocean or met buoys, which are essentially large buoys with instrumentation on them to measure things like wind speed, current speed, things like that. And in addition to this, the Coastal Commission team also believed that with the leasing of this area comes the reasonably foreseeable chance that offshore wind development will occur in the area. And to that end, we also provided a high-level siting review of what future development could look like. Before I go into the details, I wanted to speak to some of the specifics of how offshore wind will likely be developed in California. Other parts of the world have developed offshore wind, including Europe and the East Coast, but all of that development has been done in relatively shallow waters and on fixed foundations like monopiles, which are driven into the seafloor. In contrast, in California, our waters are too deep to use fixed foundation technologies, and so the turbines will be on floating foundations. And there's several potential floating foundation designs that are shown on this slide. These floating turbines will also have suspended electrical cables running between the turbines and to a substation that's floating, and then an export cable to shore. Generally speaking, compared to the East Coast projects, there will be a lot more mooring cables and electrical cables suspended in the water for a floating turbine installation than there has been for fixed foundations. Another difference is the size of the offshore wind turbines. Size in general for offshore wind turbines has been increasing both over time and as they move into the offshore environment. Offshore wind turbines are typically assembled in ports, and that means that they don't come with the same size constraints as onshore wind turbines. So manufacturers are already making 15 megawatt turbines, and the offshore wind turbines expected in California are likely to be on the larger end of the spectrum that you see here on the slide, with rotor sweep diameters of around 800 feet. So sort of switching back to the Humboldt wind energy area, when we're looking at the Humboldt wind energy area and thinking about surveys, buoy placement, and future development, we need to consider the habitats present in the area. The map on this slide shows different kinds of habitats of interest in and near the Humboldt wind energy area. The wind energy area has rocky reefs, seafloor ridges, deep sea corals and sponges, and submarine canyons to the north and south. Similarly, when we look at marine mammal densities and biologically important areas, we see that marine mammal species use the Humboldt wind energy area, but many of them are found in higher concentrations closer to shore. The map you're seeing here combines a whole bunch of different kinds of data into what's called a fuzzy logic model. Most of the data sets that went into this model are marine mammal density data sets. And that's just to say that this map flattens out the specifics for a lot of different species, and it provides a high level look at marine mammals taken all together. Darker green areas have more marine mammals and lighter green areas have fewer. To address marine mammal protection during the survey phase, the site assessment phase, we required a 10-knot speed limit for vessels, which reduces the risk of ship strikes on protected species. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on seabirds because our next presentation is completely focused on seabirds, but I did want to show a similar fuzzy logic model map for seabirds in the Humboldt Wind Energy Area. And as you can see, seabirds absolutely spend time in the Humboldt Wind Energy Area, but similar to marine mammals, they occur at higher densities closer to shore. The Humboldt Wind Energy Area is in a bit of a transition zone for seabirds. There's many coastal seabird species that typically stay closer to shore, but occasionally go out far enough to end up in the wind energy area. And then on the other side of that, there are oceanic and pelagic seabirds that typically occur farther from shore, but occasionally come close enough to the coast to end up in the Humboldt Wind Energy Area. We don't expect to see a significant impact to seabirds during the site assessment phase because lessees are collecting data and conducting surveys. They aren't going to have the big wind turbines out there yet, but we need to think about collision during the development and operations phases when considering impacts to seabirds. This makes the seabird surveys that happen during the site assessment phase really important for understanding future impacts. There's lots of potential environmental impacts to consider when reviewing construction and development of offshore wind projects. The two major resource areas where we see the potential for impacts under the Coastal Act policies are marine resources and fisheries. Marine resources and impacts to marine resources can include collision and potential displacement of seabirds, as I just mentioned, collision, entanglement, and displacement of marine mammals and sea turtles, habitat disturbance to deep sea corals and sponges from anchoring or other habitat changes like the artificial reef effect, or biological material falling from, surface infrastructure to the ground, that sort of thing. Impacts to fisheries. Oh, oops. I went way ahead there for a second, sorry. Impacts to fisheries include displacement from the lease area. All the floating infrastructure means that fishermen can't get into the wind energy area to operate their fishing gear without it getting snagged on floating or suspended cables. And depending on how the leases are developed, they will likely increase the fishermen's transit time to and from port and increase their costs for going fishing and bringing their catch to processors. Offshore wind development also has the potential to impact local communities. Our conditions for the leasing phase set up processes for the lessees to work with tribes and environmental justice communities near their projects to ensure their development and associated activities are being done in a way that benefits local communities rather than harms them. Offshore wind development will require significant post-port and industrial development on land for construction and operation, and these developments have the potential to bring significant changes to small coastal communities. And we need to ensure that these communities understand what they're signing up for. So as part of our review of the federal leasing, the Coastal Commission had several requirements or conditions to help protect the environment during the site assessment phase, which I'm going to go over on the next few slides. Our conditions ensure that the future lessees' lease assessment and characterization activities are protective of California resources and set up a series of processes to ensure that we have information we need to review the future construction and operations plans under the Coastal Zone Management Act. So quickly, our conditions include review of lessees' surveys and site assessment plans, and that includes things like marine life monitoring measures, protected species observers, spill prevention and response, plans identifying when you can have your vessel out in different sea states to ensure safety, and anchoring plans to ensure that they aren't anchoring on any sensitive habitats. Similarly, condition 2 was really straightforwardly no bottom contact on sensitive habitats, and we established an expectation that we don't want to see anchoring on sensitive habitats for future turbines either. I mentioned earlier we have a vessel speed limit of no more than 10 knots for to prevent vessel strike and ensure marine mammal safety, and processes to ensure safe navigation of fisheries. Conditions 5 and 6 were really focused on engagement with environmental justice and local communities and Native American tribes. And this was part of what I talked about earlier, where we set up processes to ensure that these communities are engaged throughout the lessees researching their lease areas and ensuring that the issues that they bring up are addressed in the project design in the future. Similarly, we had a condition that was focused specifically on fisheries. We required lessees to hire a fisheries liaison to coordinate survey activities with fishing communities. We require outreach and reporting from lessees on the work they've done with fisheries. And we also have required the the start of a working group with fisheries representatives and lessees to develop a strategy to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts of offshore wind development on fishing and fisheries. So switching gears a little bit, I wanted to, just a moment. There we go. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what has happened since our Coastal Zone Management Act review. BOEM has announced the 5 winners of its lease auction areas off Northern and Central California in 2022. Today, we really focused on the Humboldt Wind Energy area, but there's a second area off of Morro Bay as well. And I wanted to just show you this slide to give you a sense of where the leases are and their size. All the leases together cover just over 583 square miles and have the potential to produce over 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. As I mentioned earlier, we're fairly early on in this process, and now that the leases have been issued, the Coastal Commission is working with BOEM to implement our conditions. I mentioned that fisheries working group earlier. That's something that we're co-chairing with the fishing community, and we're working to develop that statewide strategy for fisheries. We're also reviewing survey plans to make sure that they follow our conditions and fall within the range of things that we reviewed back in 2022. And finally, beyond the process that we're doing for the current leases, the California Energy Commission is developing a statewide strategic plan for offshore wind. And as part of that, they've identified areas that have the potential for future leasing, which are outlined in blue on the map, in addition to the areas that have already been leased, which are outlined in black. That draft strategic plan is currently out for public comment, and the California Energy Commission expects to release a final later this year. So to summarize, there are potential benefits to offshore wind. It can help us reduce climate change and meet our energy goals. However, offshore wind may have environmental impacts, and it's important that we ensure that impacts are avoided, minimized, and then mitigated wherever possible. The Coastal Commission is committed to smart development as we move forward that is protective of the environment and coastal communities. With that, I will wrap up. Thank you again for having me, and happy to answer questions.
All right, thanks, Holly, so much for your presentation. And then I think we'll pivot to Whitney to talk about seabirds and the impacts to offshore wind, potential impacts, and then hold our Q&A portion. Thank you.
Great. All right, let me get presentation going here. All right, can y'all see my screen? Yep. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about impacts to seabirds in particular. Like Holly was saying, there's lots of animals in the offshore environment and other parts of ecosystems, plants, and other things that are going to be impacted by offshore wind. And I focus just on seabirds. And so I also want to kind of introduce you to some of the seabirds that are out here in California. So this is a black-footed albatross, which is our most common albatross species. And some of these species come close to shore, like Holly was mentioning as well, but others stay way out in the ocean, and they will be in the wind energy areas, but we'll never see them from shore unless you get in a boat. And this is one of those birds. So you may not have seen this bird, the black-footed albatross. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I think I'm going to skip a lot of the offshore wind stuff because Holly went into it really well. I'm going to talk about the seabirds that are out there. What is the risk of collision once we get the turbines in the water? So again, thinking 5 or more years in the future. And not just collision risk, but also displacement, and then conclusions and management recommendations based on what I learned. So yes, so we know how wind energy works now, and we know that we're going to be looking at turbines in the water here that are not fixed to the floor. Like this pink arrow is showing what most of the offshore wind around the world is. The platform type is this monopile, but we're going to be likely deploying floating platforms with mooring lines, as we went over before. And again, they're going to be huge, just like Holly went into, but here, what I'll point you towards is thinking about the sort of danger zone for birds. So these circles are the rotor swept zones. So that's basically where the blades will be spinning. And so that's what we're concerned about when we're thinking about seabirds colliding with the turbines. And before I start talking about California's marine ecosystems and birds, I just wanted to say that the biggest threat to seabirds and all other life on Earth is climate change. And so we do need solutions that will help us meet our clean energy goals. And so I think offshore wind is a really promising addition to our energy infrastructure that we really need to look at seriously and deploy. But we have the benefit of having all this time to plan, these agencies like the Coastal Commission that are looking at the impacts. And so we have the opportunity to do it safely, or as safely as possible, for marine ecosystems. So here in California, we have incredible biodiversity in our oceans. And the reason for that is because we have a special process that happens here called upwelling, where very cold, deep, nutrient-rich water is able to come to the surface, and those nutrients feed photosynthesizing plankton, phytoplankton, which in turn supports the rest of the ecosystem, just like plants on land support all the animals and plants and insects and everything. In the ocean, it's the foundation of the food web is really the plankton. And just as one example, this is a copepod in a microscope, which is a type of zooplankton. These are red-necked phalaropes, which are really cool seabirds that they're actually a type of shorebird, but they live way out in the ocean, and they eat copepods. So the wind energy areas, they're going to be 22 miles offshore at least, which is actually good. It means that we're not worried about any songbirds or raptors or any of the kind of terrestrial birds that we have concerns with on onshore wind farms. We're just going to be looking at seabirds. And out there, it's incredibly deep. So 500 to over 1,000 meters deep. So that's why we can't use those kinds of monopile platforms. So this is a tufted puffin, which is our Pacific Coast puffin that we have here, and they breed even around here on the Farallon Islands. Really cool, beautiful bird. And so when we think about impacts of offshore wind to seabirds, there are a few direct impacts, such as collision. So when birds collide with the turbines, they die. And so that's like the first sort of the most dangerous thing. So that's what we look at first. But then if they don't collide, there's other impacts, such as displacement from their habitat, or creating barriers where they can't move to the places of the habitat that they need. There's also indirect impacts. So for example, there's what's called the reef effect, where all the infrastructure in the water can support mollusks and other invertebrates, and that will in turn bring in fish and other things, and then it could actually attract birds and other animals to the wind farm areas. There are things like noise disturbances, light pollution, electromagnetic impacts, seabed disruptions, and of course pollution. And all of these things are going to be looked at by our agencies and by the public, and as we move through the process. But right now I'm just going to talk about the two big ones, which is collision and then displacement. Okay, so who's out there? So we have 81 species of birds that we're talking about that have been found to be in the wind energy areas, both the wind energy areas that Holly mentioned. So the one in the off of Humboldt Bay in the north, and the one off of Morro Bay in the south. Of those 81 species, 67 are what I'm calling resident, meaning they're here year round. They're not just kind of moving through on migration paths. They're actually using this environment all the time. And of those 81, 19 breed in California as well. So that's also important to consider. And so backing up, kind of what am I talking about when I'm talking about seabirds? The seabirds are typically defined as the 5 taxonomic orders that are listed here in pink. Of course, in California, we don't have penguins, which is the last one, but we have all the other ones. I'm kind of lumping in several species of ducks, grebes, and loons in with these other kind of traditionally called seabirds, because we have several species of ducks, grebes, and loons that are completely reliant on the marine environment. This is an ashy storm petrel, which is an amazing little bird. It's about the size of a robin, and it's federally endangered. And again, they also breed here on the Farallon Islands. Fortunately, we'll get to like the conclusions, but ashy storm petrels swim very low to the water. So when you think about where the birds fly and how high their flight altitude is, that's going to come into play with which species we're concerned about. So fortunately, these guys fly real low to the water, and so they're probably not going to be in the rotor swept zone. That said, so seabirds generally are very vulnerable already. So of those 81 species, 24 of them are near threatened, vulnerable, or endangered. Those statuses given by the IUCN. Globally, about 28% of seabird species are threatened, so more than a quarter of the species. And globally as well, 47% of the species are experiencing population decline. So even the species that are not yet threatened, vulnerable, or endangered, they're half of them, their populations are dropping, which is really scary. And part of the reason is because a lot of these birds have low reproductive rates. So they usually only produce 1, maybe 2 chicks in a year, sometimes even fewer. Sometimes they do like every other year breeding. And so that means that when they are threatened with something, they take much longer to recover than other animals. And they're already facing a lot of threats, such as invasive species. A lot of these birds nest on offshore islands, and offshore islands, or islands generally around the world, have had a lot of problems with invasive species causing issues in the ecology. They're often fishing bycatch, so the fishermen sometimes accidentally catch them with nets as they're trying to catch fish. Of course, climate change is changing their habitat and where they can be on the water, and then pollution, of course. So we need to think thoughtfully about offshore wind so that we don't add to this list. And this is a common murre, which is a very one of our most common seabird species, and a little chick falling behind the father. And what's cool about this species in particular is that the males actually do teach the chicks how to find food, and they kind of raise them after they fledge from the nest. So where are seabirds? So sometimes people think about the ocean as sort of like this homogeneous mix of, animals and plants are distributed evenly, but that's not the case actually. The life in the oceans is patchy. And so this is a map looking at concentration of zooplankton. So again, zooplankton is going to show you where fish are, where seabirds are, et cetera. And so you can see in the yellow areas, there are higher concentrations of zooplankton. And this is just to show that it's sort of patchy and not even. And so the birds are going to be where their food sources are. And generally, most seabirds eat some combination of fish, krill, squid, and other invertebrates. And then we need to think about, a lot of birds are migratory. So we need to think about their habitat, not just for like their breeding habitat or their overwintering habitat, but also their migration routes. Also, not all the seabird species, but some of them are highly social, and they like to nest and roost in big colonies all together. Roosting just means kind of getting out of the water and chilling out. And so they like to do that with huge numbers of their same species or their kind. So basically, the reason we think about that for offshore wind implications is if there's a roosting location, you know, maybe 10 or 20 birds start roosting there, you'll have hundreds of thousands of birds maybe later. So we need to think about the behavior of the animals as well. So how do we look at turbine collision risk? So when I was doing my master's project, I looked at two things. I looked at real case studies, so in other places in the world where they've deployed offshore wind already, and they did studies and surveys to see what birds were endangered or killed by collision. And then there's another way, which is to build a collision risk model. And so in order to do that, you need a lot of data. And once you have that data, you can sort of put it into your model and return numerical values that represent, you know, risk. But in order to do that, you have to have good data. So you need to know the flight heights and the maneuverability of the birds, and that's relative to the turbine specifications again. So how high that rotor swept zone is going to be. You need to know avoidance rates, and those are species specific. So sometimes maybe a gull will avoid the wind energy area completely 50% of the time or something. I'm just making these up as an example. Or another species might avoid it only 10% of the time. And so those avoidance rates are important to know. And then finally, the chance that the bird will collide with the blade if they don't avoid it. And that has to do mostly with how often the blade is spinning and the sort of speed of the bird, et cetera, for its maneuver through blades. So flight heights. So flight heights are really important, obviously. And again, they're species specific and they're region specific. And they change with wind speeds. So some birds, when the wind picks up, they actually drop lower. And other birds, when the wind picks up, they actually rise higher. And so we need to understand how that's going to change in different wind speeds. And they also change with different seascape uses. So if the bird is foraging, it might be, you know, flying lower. If the bird is migrating, it might be flying higher, et cetera. So we need to think about how the birds are using the seascape. This is a Sabines gull, really gorgeous, striking gull, you know, closely related to sort of our Western and California gulls that you guys see on land, probably stealing French fries. But this one is only in the offshore, way offshore. So really cool bird. Okay, so the results of all of my research found that generally collision risk is very low. So looking at both the case studies and the models, there were higher collision rates when the turbines were placed closer to nesting or roosting locations in high traffic areas such as migration routes, and then also in low visibility conditions. So basically, if the birds can see the turbines, they'll generally avoid them. And then the most vulnerable bird species groups of bird species are pelicans, terns, albatross, the larger gulls, and then skuas and jaegers. Skuas and jaegers are also super pelagic species that are only found way offshore. So this table is a lot, but it's basically the 7 actual real case studies that I looked at throughout the world. So you can see where they are in mostly Germany and Scandinavia. And then what I direct your attention to, though, the most important thing is the pink column, which is basically how many birds actually collided with turbines in their study and died. And so most of these, it was very low. And then the ones that have higher numbers we'll talk about now. So in the German Bight, where 442 birds died, the majority of those birds were not seabirds. They were actually songbirds, passerines. And the way that offshore wind area was configured was in an area where you had migration of songbirds. So in our area, because it's just way out there off the coast of California, there's not going to be migrating songbirds. And so those we don't have to worry about. So really, in terms of applying this to California, it was really 6 deaths that we should be worried about. Then I'm going to move down to this one in Belgium. So 300 29 actual carcasses found, but they estimated that they didn't catch everything or didn't see everything. And so likely as many as 523 birds died. And so now let's turn to that one. Excuse me. So this was in Belgium in 2006. And what's very different about this from California, but something that we should still consider, is that this was the shoreline. So the shore was very close, and the turbines are the black dots, and they were located on a breakwater that extended out from the shore. And then this gray blob here is a tern nesting colony. And so the terns were nesting here, and then the ocean is up in the north. And so the open water. And so every day, multiple times a day, the terns had to pass through the row of turbines in order to get to their foraging grounds. And so that's really the cause of all those collisions. And so I know for the siting of our current wind energy areas, the Coastal Commission and the other governing bodies actually did look at location and proximity to nesting locations, and our current two areas are far away from any breeding colonies, and so that's good. But we just need to, as we deploy more and more offshore wind, we need to be hyper vigilant about this. And then I wanted to bring up the concept of macro avoidance. So macro avoidance means the bird sees the wind energy area from a distance and avoids it completely, doesn't even go into the turbines. And then there's what's called meso avoidance, where the bird doesn't avoid the whole wind energy area, but goes through turbines, but still avoids blades. So this was a study that was done in Denmark. And again, they detected 0 collisions in this study, and they radar tracked some of these bird routes. And this is the visual that came out of the radar tracking. And it's pretty incredible, right? It's like you can see visually, the red dots are turbines, and you can see visually that all these black lines where the birds were flying and we tracked it, they were way around the whole wind energy area completely. Some went through, but most went completely around. And so this is good news. It means that when the birds can see it, they'll go around it. But okay, so that brings us to displacement. So if the birds go around it, it means that they're being displaced from potential habitat, from food sources, or just, the water out there is their home. And so we do need to think about that, especially as we deploy more and more wind energy areas in California. So how that's going to break up the landscape for birds is really important. And when we talk about the vulnerability of displacement, what goes into it is those macro avoidance rates, how often they're going to go way around, and their habitat flexibility. So some birds are really flexible when it comes to what they eat and where they go, and some birds are not. So just really quickly, I wanted to go through some of the recommendations. So proper siting, meaning placement of the turbines away from nesting and roosting location and off migratory routes and away from foraging grounds, preventing light attraction and the reef effect. And then preventing roosting opportunities, so not letting the bird, we basically want to keep the wind energy areas as unattractive to the birds as possible. You don't want them in there or nearby at all. And then of course we need a lot more research done, more information on flight behavior, especially in low visibility conditions. What are the birds here in California going to do when it's super foggy, when it's super difficult for them to see? And then how does the turbine spacing affect those avoidance rates too, which is something that hasn't been studied. So as if we space our turbines further apart, are the birds going to still avoid it completely or not? So that's another important thing to consider. All right, that's it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney, for your presentation. I can open it up for questions now. So folks, feel free to put questions in the chat or just unmute yourself. Okay, we have one question from David in the chat. Could you look at the conditions for coastal management? And I remember there were 7 of them. So Holly, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the conditions that the Coastal Commission recommended.
Sure. So let me just pull them back up here. Would you like me to reshare my slides or should I just talk through it?
Yeah, let's look at the visuals again. That'd be maybe good.
Okay. All right. Ah, I see. So the question is like, what counts as sensitive habitat? Yeah, so I can, sorry, I have to sort of restart my presentation and then reshare my screen. And let me go through. Okay, so node bottom contact on sensitive habitat. So for us, this means hard bottom habitat. We also talked about like seamounts. And these are areas that have some mapping done, but a lot of that mapping is going to come during the site assessment phase. So if, just in case there's some sort of a surprise on what's in the wind energy area. We also called out deep sea coral and sponge habitat because deep sea corals are just very slow growing and long lived. And frankly, so if like they found deep sea corals that are thousands of years old. And so if you, dump your anchor on top of that, that's kind of it. And that's a lot of, biological growth that has been destroyed. So that's generally what we mean by sensitive habitats.
Yeah, and I guess building off of this question a little bit, I know that folks seem to be kind of in the site assessment phase, and I think earlier this week the Yurok tribe recently came out in opposition of the Humboldt Wind Energy Project for a multitude of reasons, and I think one of the reasons that was cited was kind of like the unknown cumulative impacts of offshore wind energy. So I was curious, like what are some of the, marine resource surveying that's taking place during the site assessment phase? And maybe like if you know, Holly, like how that might be communicated to potential community groups that are interested in, offshore wind development or against offshore wind development along Humboldt.
Sure. So at this point, so the site assessment phase does include biological surveys, and I believe BOEM has guidance for avian and marine mammal surveys. At this time, the only survey plans that we have reviewed are for geophysical and geotechnical work, and so that's more focused on habitats. So, I can't speak to the specifics of how biological surveys would be conducted at this point. To speak to your question about cumulative impacts, we agree, frankly, that there's a lot of unknowns about when you look at the large scale of these 2 big areas being developed, like what does that do to migration, displacement, things like that. And one of the things that we're doing with our partner agencies is thinking through what it would look like to have a large scale monitoring entity that looks at all of these, whale migrations and these large scale ecological behaviors, and to help us understand what the impacts are and how we can adaptively manage as we move forward. I think having that monitoring in place before construction starts is really important, and having the plans in place and the check-ins to do good adaptive management as we move forward will be really critical for these projects.
Thanks, Holly. We have another question in the chat. A new technique has been discussed about painting a blade a darker color on the turbines to help distract birds. However, it's not currently a common practice. Can you share if this technique is widely utilized or recognized? So this sounds like a question maybe both for Whitney and Holly and their experience in the offshore wind space, if you know anything about this.
Yeah, there was a study that was done in the Netherlands that was pretty promising, but it was an onshore terrestrial wind farm showing that that the painting one blade did help birds see and avoid turbines. And actually, Audubon, California is going to replicate the study here in California and working with some offshore actually, sorry, working with some terrestrial wind energy companies. And so yeah, it's hard because I think the conditions in the offshore environment that are going to make the turbines difficult to see would also, the black wouldn't help with that. So, but it's, I think we should definitely look into it as a possible strategy. But so things like, misty and foggy conditions, the planing one blade black, I don't think is going to help with that, but we should study it for sure. It's worth a shot.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add on to that. I have also briefly heard of the study and it sounds really promising, but I can't say much more.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about that also, since there's not another question, is the reason that we sort of, for example, Golden Gate Bird Alliance works a lot in the Altamont Pass here in the Bay Area. And the reason that we didn't deploy it here is because they found that painting one of the blades black actually warms it. And so it attracts more insects, and then it attracts bats. And so bats are actually part of a serious problem with the Altamont Pass terrestrial turbines, is they're being killed in huge numbers. And so fortunately, again, in our offshore wind deployment, we're not going to be having to worry about bats that far out into the ocean either. So in that way, it might be better.
Yeah, I just dropped a quick Wikipedia link on the Altamont Pass. And then I have some questions kind of that I came up during with the presentation. This one's for Whitney. So I noticed, like during your review and case studies of bird collisions, a lot of them were survey methods that or surveys that were around like 6 years, there was a high variance in like the duration of survey methods. And this also maybe speaks to kind of Holly's comment on like long-term monitoring of like Humboldt offshore wind areas. But I think, it sounds like a lot of the case studies are a lot closer to shore versus, like the 22 miles we have off of off the coast of California may complicate, survey methods. So I guess could you speak more to like how collisions were monitored in your case studies? Was it mostly just like folks out in a boat kind of seeing what happens when they could, or is there like any sort of sensor or other type of way to monitor bird collisions?
Yeah, there was a lot of different techniques. So there were visual surveys where there were actually people with scopes watching. There were also radar tracking, like we saw in the Neistat case. There wore sort of like, AI visual detection, like cameras and infrared cameras being used, sort of as a more high-tech version. And then they also did some GPS tracking of birds. So actually putting GPS trackers on birds, which is obviously, more invasive to the bird and probably more expensive and difficult. But it really gets, you really understand the exact trajectory of the bird in that case. So all of the above were used in those studies. And most of the studies use multiple methods of detection, but it is really challenging. And I think we need to sort of also think about how to truth some of these tech things as they come out, which is real hard in offshore. In terrestrial wind turbines, they use ground surveys using dogs, actually, where they have dogs that come and smell for carcasses, and they can find more carcasses with the help of the dogs. Obviously, in the offshore environment, there's no way of doing that. So it's going to be a real challenge to figure out how to monitor. But I'd say using the high tech methods and then finding some way of truthing it is the best thing to do.
Yeah, that's some really great insight. Thanks, Whitney. We have another question in the chat. If the prey in the water start to collect around the offshore wind turbine area because the birds are avoiding that area, how would that impact the bird population? So, maybe like if, you know, areas in offshore wind turbines start to maybe like become an attractant for prey sources, but birds overall are avoiding them, how might that affect bird populations? Yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah. I'd love to hear Holly's perspective on this too, but really quick, one of the studies that are the case studies that I looked at, it was just one row of turbines. So it was just not like what we're going to have with multiple rows. And in that case, the birds were actually coming down, landing on the water, foraging right underneath the turbines, and then being able to take off, right? Past the turbines again, and there were no collisions in that study. But the danger is sort of we're going to have these multiple rows. It's not just like sort of just go through one. So yeah, that's what I'm concerned about when it comes to attracting birds to the area.
Yeah, I don't think we can say for certain what would happen yet. One thing to know about the turbines, though, is that if the rotor swept zone is in fact going to be about 800 feet, which is what we're expecting, the turbines have to be really far apart, like close to a mile apart. So, that we've thought a lot about fish attractant, potentially artificial reef effect and how much that would happen when they're that far apart from one another. So sort of there's that question of like how much of an attractant is it going to be if it's just kind of by itself versus this larger network of them, but they're really far spread. But also having them spread apart like that might give the birds a little more space to do their foraging and take off. So yeah, it's really hard to say at this point. It's something that we'll need to monitor.
All right, I have another question loaded up, not seen any in the chat. Holly, can you talk a little bit? I know you already kind of touched on BOEM's kind of part in offshore wind development. Can you maybe talk about some of your other state or federal partners that, you know, California Coastal Commission is working with? And yeah, elaborate maybe like how it has been balancing a lot of different, you know, regulatory authorities and interests in this kind of new offshore wind space in California.
Sure. So this my answer could end up being very long here. I guess a couple things I'll just touch on. I mentioned the California Energy Commission a couple times in my presentation, and they are the state's big energy planning body. So that's why they're doing that big strategic plan. They don't have as much of a hands-on regulatory role at this phase in the process. Some of our other really key state partners or state agency partners in this are the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They manage the California endangered species and do a lot of like the wildlife and fisheries, all the wildlife and fisheries management in the state. So we consult with them a lot on different federal consistency actions we're looking at. We also work really closely with the California State Lands Commission, and they are in some ways they're broader, they have a broader authority than BOEM, but they're similar in that they manage what's called the submerged lands underneath navigable water. So California State Lands Commission does the leasing or renting out of space on state waters if you want to, have a pier, or if you wanted, for example, to put a wind farm in state waters, the State Lands Commission would have to issue you a lease first before we could issue a permit for it. So we work really closely with them, especially as these projects, the lease areas are all in federal waters, but they are going to require state infrastructure in state waters, like the export cables and the cable landing. So we're doing a lot of work with our agency partners on that sort of thing. We also work with the Ocean Protection Council, which develops does funding and develops policy to meet state science needs. And so they're really the agency that's heading up that effort on thinking through what does a monitoring entity look like, they've just released funding to produce monitoring guidance in the near term as a starting point for that. So we work really closely with them as well. On the federal side, I would say we also, beyond working with BOEM, we also have spoken a lot with NIMPs and getting their thoughts on, animal protection as we're doing our consistency determination and that sort of thing. I see we're at time, so I will stop there. But there's a lot of collaboration involved in offshore wind permitting and regulation.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Holly, for that. I'll do like one last check on questions. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Holly and Whitney, so much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. Looks like the folks here really appreciated it as well. And the meeting is being recorded, so we'll have it posted on YouTube for other Envirothon teams to take a look at. But yeah, thank you for your time today, and have a good day, everyone.